set.
Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Welcome, everyone. Hello, Steve.
Hi, Nan.
You may recall, Steve, that last week was our first episode of the new year, 2025.
Yes.
And we mentioned to our listeners that we were going to be jumping into a film noir series for the rest of February. But we've had a little scheduling shuffle with a guest that we're going to be having coming up in a couple of weeks. So we just wanted to let you all know that we're going to bring you our 3-part film noir series later in the year.
But in the meantime, we have a really great show for you today. It always amazes me that there's so many classic film lines that we all know. You know,
Yes.
Stella!
Right,
You know,
right.
Tomorrow is Another Day. There's so
Yes.
many. But there's one in particular that we all know it, but I don't think anybody knows the actor who said it. And the line is, "It's alive! It's alive!"
That's very good, Steve.
Well, who could forget, you know, kind of the ecstasy of that cry that Dr. Frankenstein gives when he realizes that he's given life to his beloved monster.
Yes.
But the question is, who is the actor who utters the line?
Yes.
Nobody knows. We know. And we're going to talk about him today. That iconic dialogue was bellowed by British actor Colin Clive. Just as tragic as the life of Frankenstein's monster, Clive's life was pretty tragic too. So we're going to talk about this really talented and sadly forgotten actor today.
Yes. Colin Clive was born in Saint-Malo, France on January 20th, 1900 to a colonel in the British Army while on assignment in France. He was reportedly a descendant of Robert Clive, who was known as one of the architects of British rule in India. However, in some of the research that we did, this may not be completely accurate. There's a source that we'll list at the end in the show notes that refutes that he was related to Robert Clive.
You know, growing up, Clive was a very sensitive boy. He found solace in the theater rather than joining the military as was expected of him. In 1912, he began attending Stonyhurst College in England, which was a prestigious all-male Roman Catholic school whose alumni included Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. One of Clive's classmates was actually Charles Laughton, who was 7 months his senior.
Now, isn't that amazing to think that the two of them were together and neither of them knew that where their fates would
I
bring
know,
them?
2 future stars in the making.
Yeah. Now, Clive didn't perform actually in the school dramatics, but he did play clarinet in the high school orchestra.
That's sexy.
Right?
Clarinet player.
And Charles Laughton played second violin.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So Clive was actually a star athlete at Stonyhurst, both as a runner and a football player. He was named Best All-Around Athlete at Stonyhurst in the 2nd Division.
But you know, he left Stonyhurst in 1915 after just 3 years to go to Sandhurst, which was the Royal Military Academy. Perhaps he went there because it was his father's alma mater and it was a tradition in his military family. However, while there, he fell off his horse and broke his knee. This ended any dream he had of being a Bengal Lancer, which was a regiment in the British Indian Army. And probably it affected him on an emotional level as well, since British military officers dominated his family's legacy.
Right. So he clearly had to find another passion.
Yeah.
And that became acting. When he told his family of his desire to become an actor, you know, one would wonder with a military father and all of that history.
How is that going to go down?
The father was probably going to say, no way.
You're not being an actor.
This is not happening. But Clive is quoted as saying, "My family did not object. In fact, my father was extraordinarily decent about it and gave me every encouragement."
Oh, how nice. You don't
Yeah.
expect that.
Yeah.
Well, you know, he ended up going on to study at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, where he met his future wife, Evelyn Taylor. They married in 1922. So as he grew into this tall, handsome man with his chiseled face and these soulful eyes, he began to achieve some early success on the London stage. His first professional acting job came about when he left his card backstage for a prominent comic actor of the time named Charles Hawtrey. Clive didn't know Hawtrey from Adam, but Hawtrey was known for his kindness to young actors. So he agreed to meet with Clive backstage on the spot, and he offered him a part in his next play. Now, that is generous.
I know. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, so it enabled Clive to make his stage debut in the play, which was called The Eclipse, directed by Hawtrey, and that debuted November 12th, 1919 at the Garrick Theatre in London.
He remembers that he thinks just one line in that play, but it ran for 93 performances. He was getting a regular salary. So he's really kind of on his way. He's a working actor. The play closes, and at the advice of Hawtrey, who I think really kind of took him under his wing, Hawtrey recommends that he just be in as many plays as he possibly can. So he toured in various shows and spent 3 seasons with the Hull Repertory Theatre to get as much experience as possible.
Yeah, and one of the early roles he did there at the Hull Repertory Theatre was he originated the role of Steve Baker, the white husband of the biracial Julie in the London stage version of Showboat. And his early stage work so impressed the director James Whale that he cast Clive to replace the great Laurence Olivier in the complex role of the tormented alcoholic Captain Stanhope in the acclaimed R.C. Sherriff play Journey's End.
It probably also didn't hurt that the producer of Journey's End was telephoned by an actress by the name of Jean de Cassilis. Now, she was a South African actress and very famous at the time as a British vaudevillian. She recommended Colin Clive, whom apparently she wanted to marry, for the role, and did later. De Cassilis spoke with such conviction about how good Clive was that the producer agreed to an audition, and Clive was actually hired, replacing Laurence Olivier, who had another job that he had to take.
Clive actually struggled in the role, though. It was a complex role, and he really struggled with it until the playwright suggested that he take a shot of whiskey every night before going on stage.
Okay, can we just stop here for a second? Okay, that is number one, just a horrible idea in general. And number two, it's super pivotal for the rest of this man's life. Did this...
Put that shot down, Clive.
Yeah.
Obviously he suffered, severe stage fright. So this is what that playwright thought was going to cure it,
Yeah.
And the trick did work. He was able to go on. He got glowing reviews, and the play was a huge, huge success. And it had a long West End run. It was also the beginning of this dark downward spiral into his alcoholism.
Right.
So thanks, Mr. Playwright.
Yeah. Tragedy also struck early for Clive in 1929. His young wife, Evelyn Taylor, dies unexpectedly. They separated after 4 years together when she became pregnant while living with another man. Evelyn decided to have an abortion, which led to an illness that resulted in her death in 1929 at the age of just 28.
Wow.
Now, that was a few months before Clive's court date to divorce her, but I feel like he must have still been in love with her or had some feelings for her since she was the one that apparently had an affair.
Yeah, and I think it had a profound effect on him. It kept him from actually moving to New York with James Whale to open the play Journey's End on Broadway. Clive decided to stay behind. In June of 1929, he surprisingly and quickly remarried to Jean de Cassilis, who was 10 years his senior and who was his sort of benefactor who got him the first job with Journey's End.
Yeah. Some of the sources that we looked at said that how he met Jean de Cassilis probably was through Jean de Cassilis' old friend, Colette O'Neill, a.k.a. Lady Constance Malison, who was an actress at the time performing under the name Colette O'Neill. Now, she was at the Hull Repertory Theatre at the same time that Colin Clive was, and they performed in a number of productions together.
And during this time, Clive was getting his career going on stage, but he's also continuing to drink. He's still reeling from the first wife's death, and eventually he did venture to New York to seek stage work. However, his new wife stayed behind in England. But by now, James Whale has been contracted by Paramount Pictures and was given his first film directing project, a filmed version of his play Journey's End. he asked Clive to play the lead in the film. The film was a huge success, and in fact, Clive was so good in his film debut that it inspired aspiring writer Ayn Rand to write him a gushing fan letter, which you can actually see at aynrand.org. It's really cool to check out that letter.
Just a side note on Journey's End, it was actually revived on Broadway in 2007, starring Hugh Dancy, Boyd Gaines, yummy Boyd Gaines, can I add that? And Jefferson Mays.
Oh, great cast.
Yeah.
Great cast.
So Whale follows the film version of Journey's End. He follows it up with Frankenstein,
the big one.
The Big Boy, 1931, and he casts Clive as the title character. Clearly, James Whale and Colin Clive were not only good friends, but Whale really saw in Clive an amazing actor.
Yeah.
And they work on that together, and now this iconic film actually shapes the horror genre, which we talked about in our
That's
Halloween
right.
episode.
We did.
And it makes a fortune for Universal Studios. However, Clive's drinking becomes worse and worse, and it's obvious to his colleagues that he has a problem. So production on Frankenstein had to be shut down on several occasions so that Clive could sober up, and he often had to be physically held up to shoot over-the-shoulder shots.
Wow. So sad.
That is
It's just
really
so
tragic. Yeah.
Well, his Frankenstein co-star, Mae Clarke, who most people probably remember Mae Clarke, she was the actress on the receiving end of the grapefruit in her face from James Cagney in the movie The Public Enemy from 1931.
Right.
Well, she was the love interest in Frankenstein, and she said in a 1985 interview about Clive, Colin Clive was the dearest, kindest man who gave you importance. He was so wonderful, so clever. When he started acting in a scene, I wanted to stop and just watch. I'd think, here I am playing a scene with this marvelous actor. Colin was electric. I was mesmerized by him, so much so that I hoped it didn't show. When he looked at me, I'd flush. In fact, I was so glad my fiance was at the premiere that night to be my good anchor against my stormy waves of fancy for Colin. He was the handsomest man I ever saw and also the saddest. Colin's sadness was elusive. The sadness you see if you contemplate many of the master's paintings and sculptures' conceptions of the face of Christ. The ultimate source, in my view, of all sadness.
That
Wow.
is amazing.
Powerful, powerful statement.
Yeah. Well, also, in terms of quotes, according to Gregory W. Mank's book, which is all about the life and death of Colin Clive, it's called One Man Crazy, The Life and Death of Colin Clive. Clive is quoted as having really enjoyed working with Boris Karloff in the original Frankenstein and in Bride of Frankenstein. In Picture Play magazine, he was quoted as saying, I nearly laughed myself to death during the making of Bride of Frankenstein. Again and again, the director would have to call cut every time I looked at Karloff.
Well, this is a little side note. One interesting thing about Frankenstein was Boris Karloff was so grotesque and hideous in his makeup. When he was doing the scenes with Mae Clarke where he, has to go after her, she was so frightened that it really affected her performance. And so he finally went to her and he said, hey, let's make a deal. Off camera, I'm going to wiggle my pinky at you, and that's just your friend waving at you. So think about me as your friend behind this monster makeup. And that's how she got through those harrowing scenes of him chasing her, which I thought was cute and clever.
Yeah, and really says something about Boris Karloff. Yeah, that's lovely. And at this point, Clive's film career continues on opposite some pretty amazing leading ladies. But before we get to that, I think it's time for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Yes, and the question of the day is, what was the name of the film that was made about James Whale and the making of Frankenstein?
The title of the film?
The title of the film.
All right.
And who starred in it? A bonus. And a real bonus, is there anybody out there who can tell us who played Colin Clive in that movie?
Oh,
you really get points for that.
That's a good one, without Googling it.
Don't Google.
All right, we'll be right back with more about the great Colin Clive after this.
All right, Stephen Ann will be right back, but first another stop on the Hollywood tour. Hollywood is filled with stories of actors and actresses who've turned down parts in upcoming movies, right? You've heard of Marilyn Monroe being offered the role of Holly Golightly in Breakfast at Tiffany's, Hugh Jackman as James Bond in the 2006 remake of Casino Royale. Well, here's one you may not have heard of. We all know that Francis Ford Coppola directed the Godfather trilogy and that Al Pacino played Michael Corleone. Well, before Coppola and Pacino were offered those roles, roles of director and star, producers offered them to someone else, one person. Warren Beatty was offered the chance to both star in and direct The Godfather, but he turned it down. Why? Well, as he put it, quote, "I just didn't see the appeal of a mafia drama." Oh well, seems to have worked out for everyone involved after all. Now back to Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everyone. We're talking about the actor Colin Clive. But before we jump back into his film career, we wanted to give a big shout out to two listeners that we heard from, Kathy and Brian Hannigan, who are actually driving from the Twin Cities to Arizona for the winter, snowbirds as they are, and they have been listening to our podcast the whole way, like just back to back, episode after episode.
I love that.
I know, they love classic films, and we're so grateful to have you guys as listeners. Thanks, Kathy and Brian.
Thanks, guys.
Drive safe.
Well, Clive Cullen is doing well. He's on stage. He's transitioned to Hollywood. He's made Frankenstein. Well, he continues his film career with some really cool leading ladies. One of them, of course, was Katharine Hepburn, with whom he starred in Christopher Strong in 1933. It was a romantic drama which centered on a female pilot who was having an affair with a member of parliament. Well, that sounds like a great plot.
It sounds like modern day.
It does. This was actually Katharine Hepburn's second film, and it was the first in which she received top billing.
Right. Now, Clive would work with Hepburn again later that same year, this time on Broadway in that rather infamous production of The Lake in 1933. This is the production that garnered the famous quote from Dorothy Parker, who said about Hepburn's performance, "It ran the gamut of emotion from A to B." As in, boy.
Ouch.
Yeah, that's pretty awful.
Ouch. That same year, he also appeared in a supporting role in Looking Forward, which was a family drama that starred Lionel Barrymore and Louis Stone. And despite his alcoholic rampages, and apparently there were many, he continued as an in-demand leading man to many prominent actresses. He was starred as Edward Rochester opposite Virginia Bruce in Jane Eyre in 1934, which was, of course, based on Charlotte Bronte's famous novel. He starred with Bette Davis in The Girl from 10th Avenue in 1935, and he played Joan Bennett's husband in The Man Who Broke the Bank at Monte Carlo, 1935, which was, of course, a comedy romance that also starred Ronald Colman and Nigel Bruce.
In 1935, he was also in the film Clive of India about his ancestor, or
maybe ancestor, or
we
maybe
think
not.
his ancestor, yeah. And Robert Clive's efforts to create the structure for Britain's rule over India. That would be an interesting film to see now, given what we know about that whole situation.
Yeah.
But surprisingly, Clive did not play his ancestor, or not ancestor, Robert Clive. Ronald Colman did, which is kind of interesting. The film co-starred Loretta Young. Clive was quoted as saying about his role in that film, "I would have liked an opportunity to portray that hard-drinking ancestor of mine. Instead, I was given a small role that required less than 4 days' work, a role that any actor could have played." Just one question for you here, not to play armchair psychologist, but he mentions that hard-drinking ancestor of mine. So number one, we
It's
know
in his genes, maybe.
Yeah, we know that alcoholism can pass from, generation. So was that part of it? Number two, nowadays, if he was a working actor and doing as well as he was back then, wouldn't there have been people surrounding him and saying, "Buddy, get some help"?
Yeah.
And back in the day, why was nobody helping him?
I know. Where was the support system for him?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder. Or was he just seen as a cash cow?
Exactly.
Prop him up, keep him going, keep making movies, whatever it takes.
Yep.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
It was a different time.
Yeah.
We know that same year he returned to Broadway and he gave a critically acclaimed performance in Libel in 1935, which was directed by the great Otto Preminger. In that play, Clive portrayed Sir Mark Loudon, a war hero and member of Parliament who sues a newspaper for libel.
He also starred in the horror classic Mad Love, 1935.
Great movie, by the way.
I haven't seen that.
Oh, it's so creepy.
Okay.
So good.
Well, he stars with Francis Drake and Peter Lorre in Peter Lorre's American film debut. In the film, Clive plays the concert pianist husband of Drake. Now, this plot is just crazy.
Oh, wait do you see the movie?
So, listen to this.
Good.
So, he's a concert pianist. When his hands are badly crushed in a train accident beyond the power of standard medicine, His wife begs the mad doctor to help. So the doctor decides to graft the hands of the executed murderer onto Colin Clive surgically.
Ooh.
We know what's going to happen here, right?
Those hands have a mind of their own.
Oh, yeah. The surgery is a success, but the killer's hands, yep, they got a mind of their own. You nailed it. And Clive can't control them. And, gee, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Right?
If you haven't seen this movie and you love horror movies, it is grade A, top-notch
All right,
suspense.
That might be on the
and
list.
Peter
for
Lorre's
tonight.
so good.
We love Peter Lorre. Here's a clip from Mad Love, 1935.
Was it you who telephoned me to come here? Yes. You said you'd tell me the truth about my hands. They throw knives. How'd you know that? I have no hands. Yours. They were mine once. I knew it. He lied. And so, when you knifed your father in the back last night, you killed him with my hands. I killed my father? No. I threw a knife at him yesterday, but I... Last night, No, you remember now? No. Since I left Dr. Gurgola, I can't remember anything.
All right, another pause here for a second. Are we seeing a pattern here of characters that he's playing?
Yes, totally.
Yeah, right? They're either crazy or they're military or they're in Parliament.
I know. That's so funny.
Yeah.
Well, by the time that Clive and James Whale reunited for Bride of Frankenstein in 1935, which of course starred the great Elsa Lancaster, Clive was so far gone with his drinking that many of his scenes actually had to be filmed with him lying down.
Oh.
So sad. His appearance began to change and he suffered this great weight loss. So you could tell, the alcoholism had taken its toll. He was no longer reliable, yet no one seemed to do anything to help him, like we were just talking about. He eventually alienated his wife, James Whale, and any other friend who tried to help him. He sank further and further into this dark pit with each sip of the bottle.
In 1937, he stars as Jean Arthur's husband in the romance History is Made at Night. Clive plays a wealthy ship owner, Bruce Vail, who is extremely possessive of his wife, Irene. Irene is in love with Paul Drummond, played by Charles Boyer. The insane jealousy of Clive's character leads to divorce and a lot more problems.
And I just want to add here, because I've seen History is Made at Night, and it's a really great movie. But if you look at Colin Clive's appearance from Mad Love, which he made in 35. If you look at him in this movie, which I think was made in 37, the physical change is harrowing. You really see it on his face in this movie. It's so sad.
And keep in mind, everyone, he was very young.
Yeah.
I mean, he was in his 30s.
30s, exactly.
Yeah. His final screen performance found him supporting Paul Muni and Miriam Hopkins in the war romantic drama The Woman I Love, 1937.
And sadly, on June 25th, 1937, Clive died in Los Angeles of tuberculosis brought on by his acute alcoholism. While actors Peter Lorre and Alan Mowbray were two of the pallbearers at his lightly attended funeral, neither James Whale nor his wife, with whom he had been estranged for years, attended. Years later, Clive's wife, she was also an actor, she wrote an autobiography and didn't even mention Clive. So sad.
Just to add insult to injury, sadly, Clive's remains were left unclaimed at the funeral parlor for over 40 years.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that just
breaks your heart.
His ashes were finally scattered at sea in 1978, and there is a cenotaph honoring him at the Chapel of the Pines Crematory in Los Angeles, where he was cremated.
And for those of you who need to know what a cenotaph is, which I was one of those people.
I was too.
And I had to
That's
look
so
it up.
funny.
It's actually a monument that marks your passing at a place that you're actually not interred.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That does.
Yeah.
That does.
And actually, a good example of that is there's that great cenotaph cenotaph of Toto the dog at Hollywood Forever when Toto's not actually there.
Right. Yes. I learned a new word during this episode as well.
I did too.
Yeah. Well,
see, we're educational.
Yeah, we're a very educational podcast. And we're also a podcast that is just bringing
It talks
up
about sad, drunk people.
I know. And just the tragedy.
Yeah.
You know, before we were recording today, we talked about, there was some expert that was talking about the passing of Matthew Perry and how if he hadn't been an actor, that maybe he would still be alive.
It's so true.
And that whatever Colin Clive was going through, that drink to get him on stage, to get through his stage fright, could that have been something that triggered something in his brain that if he had never been an actor, you know?
Exactly. And, you know, and it makes me think about the tragic actress Gail Russell.
Yes.
You know, it's very well documented that she had such severe stage fright that, you know, some well-meaning person told her, just take a shot of booze before you go on.
Right.
And that was the beginning of the end for her. So I think that might have played a part in his demise.
Right. And as we know, Hollywood is all about making money. As you said earlier, maybe they just wanted to keep propping him up and using him as a cash cow.
Yeah, so sad.
Well, I think it's time for the answer to this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
And of course, the question was, what's the name of the movie that was made not too long ago that was about James Whale and the making of Frankenstein?
Gods and Monsters.
That's right. It was Gods and Monsters from 1998, which was directed by Bill Condon and starred Ian McKellen as James Whale, and Brendan Fraser also starred in that as well. But the second part of the question was, who was the actor who played Colin Clive? If anybody gets this, I want you to email us and
immediately
say, I knew it and I did not Google it.
Yes. Well, I think this actor might live in LA, so maybe he's listening.
He did. Maybe he is. And it is the actor Matt McKenzie.
Yes.
So thank you, Matt, for a great performance.
Well, I'm glad we get to highlight somebody who people may not know his name, and maybe now they do.
I know.
We are so grateful that you spend this time with us, everyone. Thank you so much. And we would love it if you would follow us on social media. Our handle is @From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. You can find us on YouTube, where you can watch the podcast, and you can also find us on Instagram and Facebook. And wherever you listen to podcasts, we'd love it if you'd give us a 5-star review.
And we love your emails. We get some great emails from you guys, some great questions, some great suggestions. So please keep them coming. You can email us at info@frombeneaththehollywoodsign.com, and especially email us if you knew that Matt McKenzie played Colin Clive in Gods and Monsters.
That's this week's Sad View.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. Happy New Year.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Ann McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review, and tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebly. Associate producer and researcher John Price Ritchie. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebly and Toth. Copyright 2025. All rights reserved. That's a wrap.